thank you for inviting me to be part of the conference today, and thanks especially to Hayden and Jasmine for making it possible for me to do this by video and keep my carbon footprint as small as possible. Now, I was asked to talk about consumerism as the elephant in the room, but really at this point I don't think any one of us, at least watching this, really thinks that consumerism is the elephant in the room anymore. It's more like the elephant that has smashed its way out of the room, destroyed the house in the process, crushed our gardens, and trampled our grandmother before running back off into the woods. It is, in other words, the root cause that is driving humanity towards ecological collapse. And now, with consumerism spreading more and more quickly around the world, with another billion consumers projected to join the ranks by 2025, it's driving us toward the brink of civilizational collapse as a hot world comes into play and other ecological systems break down. We can't keep going on as consumers. We can't organize our societies around this idea that the more we consume, the happier we are. We can't keep promoting this mindless high level of consumption. Instead, we're going to have to radically degrow our economies. We're going to have to transform our cultures so that this idea of consumerism becomes a taboo. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all for a steady state economy, as I think many of you are advocating in this room, but not before a rapid and huge amount of degrowth. Rather than this idea of a circular economy, which I think, like a steady state economy, we need to get to, it's more appropriate probably to say a spiral economy, where we spiral down several circuits of growth and ratchet down our consumption dramatically before stabilizing at a much simpler and smaller economic throughput that would, of course, then be designed cradle to cradle and fully circular. Of course, before we can get to that ideal sustainable future, we would have a massive amount of degrowth, especially in rapacious countries like the United States, where they have a we have a four-planet footprint. At least a quarter of our economic throughput has to go. But realistically, if developing countries continue to grow, which I'm sure they will, and if our own population continues to grow, we're going to have to degrow even more. And this is not going to be possible just through technology. A factor 5 through technical changes, was a nice idea 20 years ago, but not realistic. In fact, I'm going to show you one slide in this presentation, and specifically that is a slide from the excellent chapter from Jenny Moore and Bill Reese in State of the World 2013, a project I co-directed for World Watch. And their chapter is getting to a one-planet living. And as the table shows, as you look at it, we need to consume far fewer calories, we need to eat far less meat, we need to fly less, drive less, we need to have fewer cars, we need to have more people per household and smaller households at the same time. This amount of change is what's needed to get from a three-planet society to a one-planet society. And just looking at how difficult even one of these would be. Cars, for example. Instead of a half a car per person, we would need 4 cars for every 1,000 people. That's the level of scale of change that we have to go through. So in other words, in a city like mine, Washington, D.C., with a population of 630,000, we could have a car fleet of about 2,500. Now, once you have the cars for police and ambulances and fire trucks and city buses and school buses, you might have 1 car left over for the president and maybe a small fleet of rental cars and taxis. But the idea of private cars, that era is over. Whether they run on electricity or hydrogen or biofuels or unicorn dreams, it doesn't matter. There's not enough ecological space to continue this idea that we can have a technical transition to a sustainable future. In other words, a sustainable future, if we're lucky, looks something more like Cuba. Strong literacy in healthcare, lifespans as high as developed countries, maternal mortality on par with the United States, even at just 1 planet footprint compared to America's 4 planet footprint. They have low consumption, low overweight and obesity rates, just 11%, in part because a lot more people are growing their own food and there's a lot less access to toxic processed foods that developed countries are swimming in. The alternative sustainable future is not a high-tech one. It's more like an African slum, right? People have short lifespans. They're living with such low levels of consumption that they're technically sustainable, albeit miserable. This is not anything that any of us would want to choose, but by not making the tough choices of proactive degrowth, this is where we're heading. We're pushing our ecological systems to the point where they'll collapse, and the majority of us will probably live in nasty, brutish, Hobbesian states. So the question is, how are we going to degrow? And I would argue, and if any of you have heard me speak before, this line is common. I would argue that we need to transform cultures to make it feel as natural to live sustainably as living as a consumer feels today. This is at the heart of some of my earlier work, the State of the World 2010, Transforming Cultures from Consumerism to Sustainability. And I really strongly believe that we need to learn from the cultural engineers that were so successful in making a consumer economy and making a consumer culture feel so natural. Learn from them and apply those skills towards making a sustainable culture. And I would look at all different institutions that have been used to make a consumer culture: government, both subsidies and taxes and policies, media and marketing. $500 billion a year right now is spent just on commercial advertising. Add to that all the product placements and PR and all of that. And it's not surprising that we're consumers. In fact, just use one example. McDonald's is a real powerful culture changer. Right? Just one company, it spends $1 billion a year on marketing. It has 35,000 franchises now. And they really target children because they know that if they shape children's palates for high-fat, high-sugar, high-salt foods for their food, they'll be coming back throughout their lives. So they invest in cartoon mascots and clown role models. They invest in playgrounds and toys in their Happy Meals. All of this to build their customer base for a lifetime. And now add to that, of course, all the other franchises, fast food franchises, all the other food companies, the food companies that have infiltrated public schools in many countries, including the U.S. And it's not surprising that America has a 70% overweight obesity rate, that more and more children are getting fatter and fatter earlier, and that children are craving these kinds of foods and no longer have a taste for healthy and sustainable fare. But the good thing about that is that they have shown a very effective model of cultural change, and we need to simply apply some of these basic sets of institutions, use these institutions to get to a sustainable future, to a sustainable culture. And this report that I'm mentioning goes into all 6 institutions: government, business, education, media and marketing, social movements, and traditions. All of these can be really effectively used to normalize a sustainable culture. Now, I only have 20 minutes today, so I'm not going to go into the many good examples there, but if you go on to transformingcultures.org, the entire report is free to download. There's 34 chapters that go into a lot of these different examples: greening rituals, for example, or school food reform, or social marketing. All of these are filled with examples and ideas of how we can normalize a sustainable culture and oust the consumer culture. But to be honest, the idea that we will proactively get to degrowth when there are so many moneyed interests, so much power pushing us towards a growth, increased consumerism, cultural and economic model, it's just not realistic. So the question has to become, at least in part, how do we get ready for the long emergency? And my key suggestion is that any efforts that we pursue to build resilience must be in the context of pursuing degrowth. In other words, the last thing we want to do is to make our unsustainable consumer economy more resilient. That'll just lead to a much harder crash when the collapse comes. The metaphor I've been trying to use for this is that of the story of Icarus. If Daedalus, Icarus' father, had built his son's wings out of more than just wax and feathers, Icarus probably wouldn't have survived anyway. He would have just flown higher before the sun melted his wings and destroyed his wings before he crashed into the sea, causing even more damage. Of course, Icarus was going to die from 100 feet or 500 feet, but the bigger we grow, the worse the suffering and death toll is going to be. So it would be good if we are doing degrowth processes and projects that make us more resilient. It will not be a smart idea to bolster the consumer economy and make that more resilient. So yes to small-scale local community farms, no to seawalls around Manhattan and Wall Street and Fifth Avenue. So, let's look at some of those degrowth projects quickly, and you can see, public infrastructure is an obvious one that can help actually reduce private consumption as well as make societies more resilient. As you build mass transit or bike sharing opportunities or public water systems, those are going to not only reduce demands for cars and bottled water, but also insulate societies as systems break down. Having shared bikes is going to be great when suddenly fuel prices skyrocket. But also overlooked public goods like libraries, and not just book libraries, but toy libraries, seed libraries, tool libraries. All of these can be cultivated and created as public goods or private goods, ideally public, that have the full support of local governments, not just kind of communities that have to try to maintain a tool library itself. But all of that can displace a lot of private consumption. Who's going to buy a book from Amazon if you can go online, order it from the local library, and pick it up in a very convenient spot? In Madrid, for example, they have library kiosks right in the metro system. So if you actually had that kind of convenience with the libraries in other countries, then you could actually displace a lot of private consumption. At the same time, with rebuilding public infrastructure, rebuilding local communities and economies is a strong one. It's an obvious one. I think Juliet Schor has really talked about it well with her plenitude economy framing. The more people we extract from the consumer economy, the better. If we can start making households multiple styles of revenue, some in the formal economy, some in the informal local economy, some in the caregiving household economy, that's a much safer strategy than continuing to just put everybody in the workforce in a fragile consumer economy that will eventually break down. My thought is that we need to once again get back from the current 2% of Americans as farmers to 40, 50, even 60% of Americans with a hand in farming. Whether that's a household garden or a local farm or community gardening, so that many more people are growing their own food and need less income and need less industrial manufactured food from big unsustainable farms. In fact, my latest effort at WorldWatch through the Transforming Cultures project is actually to try to use media to transform cultures and get that cultural norm encouraged and out there. Specifically, I'm, of all things, working on a reality television show. It's in development stage now, but we're working to create a show called Yard Farmers, where we would take 6 young Americans and get them to move back in with their parents in their homes in a very diverse set of settings, local, small city, small town, big city, diverse set of socioeconomic classes and subcultures and races. Everything would be very reality TV friendly with a lot of diversity and interesting characters, but at the same time the deeper message would be encouraging and celebrating the idea of multi-generational households, getting young people to move back in with their parents and not be ashamed of that but be proud of that as they're building a resilient household economy. And they're helping to make their community also more resilient, more sustainable, more food secure, reducing hunger in their area if that's a concern, and so on. And while this might sound trivial, the 5th largest crop in America is grass. And that's not the smokable kind. That's the American suburban lawn, 40 million acres of lawn in America. And that's a carbon cost right now between fertilizer and pesticides and lawnmower gasoline. All of this is these lawns cause significant pollution, local pollution and climate change. But imagine transforming all those lawns into small organic household gardens where people are displacing industrial food, they're making their household and communities more food secure, they're creating carbon sinks, they're creating biodiversity, local hotspots as they grow a diverse set of crops. There's a real potential there, not just kind of at the aggregate, but also to celebrate those local efforts that everyone can do. And most importantly, in a degrowth economy or any sort of contracting economy, it's the youth that are often first displaced from the economy. Look at Spain and Greece. You see 50 and 60% youth unemployment rates there. Yard farming could create a new opportunity for young people, especially as they're displaced from formal markets. But it could also create a whole new set of related economic activities. A person to transport the surplus food to the city, people to teach these basic skills, people to run the tool libraries in the community, and so on. And it would hopefully really help to rebuild the cultural norm around multi-generational living, which is essential. We're going to have to recognize that these large suburban homes that are part of our heritage now are going to need to be filled up with a lot more people. My hope is the show will get people to really try yard farming, and more importantly, even if they don't, it'll plant a seed so that when the proverbial shit hits the fan, and there are very few formal economic opportunities in the consumer economy, people will remember this show and the basic skills that were taught on that show, how to compost, when to plant seeds and seedlings, what weeds to actually pull up and which ones to eat, like dandelions, and so on, so that they can actually not panic when suddenly there's no food in the local grocery store, but can get to work and start converting their unproductive, costly lawn into their own source of food security. The hope, though, is that these seeds, this program and other projects, all add up to the cultural change that's needed to get us to a new sustainable culture. And in reality, that's probably not going to happen with such a strong consumer culture and so much momentum behind it. But eventually that consumer culture is going to fail, and a cultural vacuum will open up. And if we're not building the foundation for a sustainable culture now, then that vacuum will most likely be filled with some sort of fundamentalism, whether that's a religious fundamentalism, whether that's some sort of fascism, but people will seek that kind of strong-handed philosophy out as a system destabilizes around them. The hope is that we instead provide a sustainability-based model based on sharing and community support and food security and resilience that can compete in the field of ideas with these other philosophies that try to fill the consumer vacuum. And the more projects we start, the more we work towards creating a sustainable culture, the higher the odds that a sustainable culture will arise from the ashes of this old failed consumer economy and culture. The hope is that over the centuries, a sustainable culture will take root so that we don't once again follow a growth model that grows and pushes us beyond the limits of the planet and then just crashes again and causes more suffering, centuries from now. Instead, any civilization that flourishes in centuries from now, after our next dark age perhaps, will hopefully deeply internalize the understanding that the earth is finite and that humanity and its well-being completely depends on obeying Earth's laws. So with that, thank you very much for including me. I hope I can join the Q&A right now. There is a slight time difference from the US, and if I'm not able to, I will put my email up in a moment, and you can email me any questions you have or comments, and I'd be happy to correspond over email. Thank you.